Void Miner, Guild of Stone, Part 6, Chapter 26, Bonds Tested. The hub's corridors were alive with fire before Arg even rounded the junction. Not the bright, comforting blaze of a cooking fire, but the chaotic, hungry tongues of smoke and heat that tore through the metal skeleton of the station. Each corridor had its own character under the stress of the emergency. One warped and sagging, panels blackened and bubbling. Another packed with panicked miners, scrambling in every direction. The heat rolled off walls in waves, stinging exposed skin even through layers of fire-resistant gear. Soot and smoke filled the air, heavy and thick, catching in every breath, searing lungs and throats. The acidic smell of scorched wiring and melting insulation made every step forward a conscious effort against nausea. Sector 3 blocked, Arg barked as he sprinted towards the nearest obstruction. Boots pounding against the grating, the vibration of the station's life support systems thrumming beneath him. Sparks erupted from a conduit overhead, arcing dangerously close to a cluster of miners. He ducked instinctively, hand brushing against the hot bulkhead as he shoved them aside. Low, low, stay down, move. Kara's voice came through the comms with that calm precision he had learned to rely on, clipped, commanding, yet carrying an undertone of urgency that drove people into action rather than panic. Evac routes compromised, North Corridor open for staggered flow. Miners, follow lights. Don't stop. Security manage flow and contain panic. He ducked another spark, wiping soot from his eyes. Kara, the east conduits, what's their status? His voice carried over the roar of alarms, pumps, and distant cracking of heated metal. Fluctuating, she replied without hesitation. Manual overrides in sectors 4 through 6 are jammed. Someone knew what they were doing, someone with access. Sabotage, Arg. This wasn't an accident. He felt a familiar tight knot in his stomach. He had dealt with sabotage before, seen the fingerprints of methodical malice, and he hated it as much now as he had years ago. Someone wanted to break the hub. Someone wanted to test the guild before it had fully formed. And perhaps worse, someone wanted to test him. Understood, he muttered. He shoved aside a warped metal panel blocking the emergency exit to Sector 3. Sparks leapt from exposed wiring, stinging his forearms, but he ignored the pain. 6 miners stumbled into the corridor, coughing, eyes wide in terror. He grabbed the nearest one, steering him towards the exit. Follow me. Keep low. Don't stop moving. The chaos around him had its own rhythm. Cries of fear, shouted orders, and the hiss of failing oxygen flowed through the corridor in a symphony of stress. Yet in the middle of it, Kara's voice, calm and authoritative, served as a counterpoint. Steady and sure. She was always 3 steps ahead, anticipating system failures and rerouting emergency protocols before he even realized what he needed doing. Corridor after corridor they moved. Arg guided miners through smoke and debris, checking for blocked paths and collapsed ceilings, calculating every moment in the back of his head. Each moment was tense. One wrong decision could spell death. At the same time, Kara's fingers flew over the console panels, overriding jammed doors, rerouting oxygen, and stabilizing failing circuits. He stole a glance at her, noticing the streaks of soot across her pale skin, the strands of hair plastered to her forehead with sweat. Her concentration was absolute. Her calm, unyielding focus grounded him amid the chaos, even as fear threatened to slip through the cracks in his own control. He realized, not for the first time, that he trusted her completely in this environment. That trust was rare, scarce, hard-earned, but she had it. By the 4th corridor, the fire had gained a foothold. Flames curled through ventilation ducts, casting flickering shadows on the walls. While black smoke clung to the ceiling, thick and oppressive, sparks fell erratically, bouncing off metal bulkheads, threatening to ignite further chaos. Arg's gloves scorched as he moved past exposed wiring, and the heat pressed against him like a tangible force, heavy and suffocating. He guided the miners in low, quick steps, counting heads as they went, barking orders in a voice hoarse from smoke and exertion. "Kara, the north doors! Blocked!" he shouted. "I'm overriding now," she responded, already typing commands into the nearest panel. "You get them out first." Arg gritted his teeth, straining to open the stubborn metal doors manually. Sparks rained down around him, some hitting the floor with a hiss. Finally, the doors yielded, and the miners spilled into a cleared corridor. "Keep moving. Stay low," he urged. The fire's spread was unpredictable, moving along conduits, creeping across bulkheads, threatening oxygen lines. Each corridor had to be assessed individually. Arg moved through the corridors like a ghost of purpose and instinct, leading miners, blocking dangerous passages, rerouting traffic and avoiding falling debris. Each step was a calculation of risk versus reward, every move deliberate. Meanwhile, Kara continued her silent orchestration from the consoles, rerouting power away from damaged circuits, ensuring oxygen levels stabilized where they could, opening emergency hatches remotely, and communicating with security teams. Her calm, methodical actions contrasted sharply with the raw physical exertion and instinctive urgency that drove Arg. Together, they formed a unit, complementary, unspoken in their coordination. Time blurred. Hours passed in the heat, smoke, and chaos. The fire continued to gnaw at the station's structure, lapping along conduits and across maintenance hatches, threatening both lives and the fledgling reputation of the guild. Arg led miners out in successive groups, teaching them to stay low, move quickly, and obey orders without question. Panic was a constant threat, yet he enforced discipline with calm, unwavering authority, his voice cutting through the smoke and the screaming alarms. Kara's eyes flicked across panels, monitoring heat sensors, oxygen levels, and emergency valves. Every flick of her wrist, every keystroke, was a lifeline for someone trapped in the corridors. They communicated with nods, gestures, and the occasional shouted orders, bypassing words when action was clearer. By the 6th hour, the fire had been partially contained. Smoke still billowed in packets. Heat pressed against the bulkheads, and emergency lights flickered intermittently, casting grotesque shadows. Exhausted miners had been accounted for, their panic subsiding in cautious relief. Arg leaned against a scorched bulkhead, helmet off, sweat and soot streaking across his face, breathing hard. Kara approached him, quiet. "We contained it," she said. "No lives lost." Arg exhaled, a faint grin tugging at his lips. "This time," he muttered. His eyes scanned the scorched corridors, flickering over twisted metal and blackened panels. "But someone will try again. They'll come for the hub, for the guild, for us." Her gaze was steady. "Then we'll be ready, together." He nodded, the weight of her words settling in his chest. Trust wasn't freely given in the belt. Survival was brutal, unforgiving. And yet, here it was, solid, real, undeniable. Kara's presence beside him was a shield and a promise. Repair teams moved through the corridors over the next several days, replacing warped panels, rerouting conduits, and shoring up weak bulkheads. Investigators traced points of sabotage, manual overrides, tripped circuits, blocked ventilation ducts, and manipulated oxygen feeds. Each deliberate failure had been designed to terrify and destabilize the hub. Every new failure discovered carried the same message. Someone wanted to break the guild before it had a chance to prove itself. Arg worked tirelessly alongside the miners, overseeing emergency drills, coordinating repair teams, and reinforcing contingency plans. Each successful maneuver was a testament to the guild's growing credibility. Each step taken to stabilize the station reinforced the miners' trust in the new structure forming around them. The corridors still bore the fire's scars, blackened panels, warped bulkheads, flickering conduits. But life had returned. Miners moved with purpose again, carrying tools, replacing damaged equipment, and running checks. The fire had been a crucible, burning away fear, leaving only clarity, determination, and a deepened sense of shared purpose. Kara moved beside Arg, monitoring diagnostics, oxygen lines, and structural integrity. Words were rarely exchanged. Their coordination was almost instinctual. They communicated in nods, gestures, and occasional clipped orders, a language forged in months of shared trials. The bond between them, already strong, had been tempered in the heat of the fire. By the end of the week, the station was functional again, though scars remained. Arg stood at the viewport in the window's berth, watching the distant station lights. Burned marks on walls and bulkheads reminded him of how close the fire had come. Miners were back at work, the guild firmly established in reputation, but Arg's thoughts lingered on the trust, betrayal, and vigilance. Kara joined him, silent. The fire had tested them beyond just emergency response. It had tested their leadership, resolve, and bond. "They can do all they want," Arg said quietly, "but we survived. The guild survived." "And if they come again?" she asked. "We'll survive again, together." He exhaled, a trace of a smile appearing. Better than being alone, better than anywhere else. The sabotage had proven one thing. The guild was not merely a concept. It was a force in the belt, and it could withstand deliberate attacks. Arg's leadership had been tested. Kara's efficiency had been proven, and the miners had witnessed the power of organized, coordinated response. Bonds had been forged in fire, trust cemented in smoke, and a quiet determination settled over Arg. He would not allow the hub to fail, the guild to crumble, or the miners to be left vulnerable. Looking at Kara, side by side, in the dim emergency lighting, he realized, finally and fully, that he didn't have to face these challenges alone. Not anymore. Chapter 27. Subtle Signs. The hub was quieter than usual in the early morning, but it carried the low hum of activity that never fully died. The distant whine of transport lifts, the clang of crates being moved, the chatter of workers coordinating schedules, all of it echoed through the metal corridors and grated lightly against Kara's nerves. She moved deliberately, boots scuffing against the worn decking, clipboard clutched to her chest. The air smelled faintly of machinery, grease, and recycled heat. She had long ago stopped noticing the tang of burnt metal in the air, the way the hub seemed to carry the weight of 100 ships passing through each week, each leaving its residue. Her stomach churned briefly as she passed the northern support base. A dull queasiness she hadn't expected made her pause and press a hand slightly over her abdomen. She frowned. The shift had been long. The last night's minimal sleep was catching up. Stress, fatigue, maybe something she had eaten wrong. Whatever it was, she shook it off, straightened her posture, and continuing down the corridor. Arg appeared around the corner with his usual measured pace, carrying a crate of tools. His eyes caught hers, and he gave a small nod. "Morning," he said. His voice was low, steady, carrying that constant undertone of unspoken concern he seemed to reserve only for her. "Morning," Kara replied, forcing a smile. She didn't mention that fleeting discomfort. There was no need, and she wasn't certain why it had come at all. Perhaps it was just the morning catching up with her, or the lingering fatigue from yesterday's rounds. They moved together toward the assembly area for the guild teams, side by side but not touching. Kara focused on the clipboard in her hands, reading over the notes she had compiled during the previous shift. Some of the measurements and panel checks were incomplete, and she would have to redo them today. She breathed slowly, trying to shake the small wave of nausea that lingered like a shadow at the edge of her focus. By mid-morning, Kara had begun inspecting the northern corridors in earnest. She leaned over a warp support panel, hands steady despite the subtle flutter in her stomach. Sweat beaded lightly on her hairline. Her shirt clung faintly to her back, a reminder of the hub's oppressive heat despite the cooling systems. She bent and straightened repeatedly, checking measurements, marking stress lines, noting which sections needed reinforcement. Each time she adjusted her stance, the queasiness returned, subtle but persistent. She pressed a hand to her abdomen reflexively, trying to mask her discomfort, reminding herself it was probably nothing more than fatigue or overexertion. Arg joined her a few moments later, kneeling beside the panel to check the support bolts and adjacent conduits. His hands moved with the practiced precision of years spent in zero-G and cramped compartments. Kara noticed the warmth of his proximity, the unspoken reassurance in his quiet presence. She straightened and refocused on her clipboard, trying not to dwell on the brief rise of awareness that came with being near him. "You've double-checked the stress points?" he asked. "Yeah," she said. "Temporary reinforcements in place. Conduits rerouted to prevent strain. The panel itself is stable for now." Arg nodded once, eyes scanning the surrounding corridor. He didn't comment on her momentary pause or the way she had pressed her hand over her midsection. He trusted her to manage herself, and she allowed him that small veil. Lunch came quietly. Kara sat on a crate near the viewport, legs drawn close, clipboard set aside. She chewed mechanically on a ration bar, the taste metallic and faintly sweet, trying to ignore the persistent flutter in her stomach. It was strange, mild nausea without other symptoms, fatigue that seemed disproportionate to the work she had done. She told herself it was the fire last week, the long hours, the constant alertness. It had to be something mundane. Arg settled across from her, opening his ration pack. The scent of dried protein and recycled water filled the space between them. He looked at her briefly, eyes narrowing slightly in quiet concern, but he didn't ask. He trusted her to speak if she needed. Kara appreciated that, and she leaned back, resting a hand lightly against the crate. "You look tired," he finally said, voice neutral. "I'm fine," she replied quickly, forcing a smile. She didn't want to sound weak or faltering. "Not here, not now. Just the shift catching up with me." He gave a small nod, accepting the explanation at face value. Kara exhaled softly, silently grateful for the lack of further questioning. The afternoon passed in a haze of activity. Kara moved from panel to conduit, clipboard in hand, issuing minor instructions to the guild teams. The hub had recovered quickly from the fire, but cracks remained in more than just the walls. There were tension among the miners, disagreements over priorities, and the ever-present need to keep safety a visible, immediate concern. Kara's attention had to be divided between maintaining physical safety and managing human behavior. At one point, she bent low to inspect a panel in a recessed corner, the queasiness returning stronger, making her pause and straighten slowly. She pressed her hand to her abdomen again, biting her lip. Perhaps she had pushed too hard this morning. Perhaps it was just nerves. She shifted weight from one foot to the other, hiding the subtle tremor in her hands as she wrote notes on her clipboard. Arg approached silently, kneeling beside her without a word. He adjusted a conduit with careful precision, the familiar rhythm of his movements grounding her slightly. They finished the check together, side by side, each aware of the other's presence without comment. When their hands brushed while moving a panel into place, Kara startled slightly, heart racing, but she kept her focus on the work. Evening drew near. The hub dimmed as automated lighting adjusted for the station's rotation cycle. Miners finished securing their equipment, and the echo of voices and machinery softened. Kara and Arg walked back towards the widow, their steps deliberate, carrying the quiet weight of exhaustion. Kara's stomach fluttered intermittently, a subtle reminder that something inside her was changing, though she had no clear explanation. A quiet settled between them as they boarded the widow. The familiar hum of the ship system welcomed them like an old friend. Kara leaned against the bulkhead, letting herself absorb the steady vibration of the engines, the faint warmth of the electronics, the hum that resonated through the metal floors. She pressed her hand lightly over her abdomen once more, feeling the subtle shift of her body as if in silent communication. She still told herself it was just fatigue. Arg moved to the cockpit, setting down a crate of tools with a clunk. He glanced at her, noting her pallor and the faint tension in her posture, but said nothing. His silence was understanding, a constant in a world that had been unpredictable for far too long. Kara allowed herself a small private exhale, the first release of tension since the morning. As night deepened, Kara settled into her bunk, careful to position herself comfortably. The fluttering in her stomach persisted, subtle, insistent, unnameable. She traced a finger lightly across her midsection, trying to find a rational explanation. Fatigue, stress, perhaps a lingering effect of the hub's air quality or the long hours she had put in recently. Anything but the truth, for now. Arg remained in the cockpit, monitors dim, eyes scanning the quiet readouts from the station's sensors. He didn't look at her. He trusted her space and privacy. And Kara was grateful. The shared silence between them carried a depth of unspoken trust, and for a moment she allowed herself to rest fully, letting her body relax while her mind churned through the day's events. The weight of responsibility, the subtle signs from her body, the quiet closeness of Arg, everything pressed against her awareness simultaneously. She allowed herself to focus only on the hum of the ship, the dim glow of the instruments, and the faint echo of distant station activity. By the time sleep threatened to pull her under, Kara lay still, hand resting lightly over her abdomen, uncertainty lingering like a shadow. She didn't know why she felt this way. Perhaps it was nothing at all. Perhaps it was something that required attention. For now, she let it be, allowing the steady rhythm of the widow and the silent presence of Arg to carry her into the night. The fluttering persisted, a quiet, unspoken signal. Kara did not name it. She did not guess. She only noted it, and in that small acknowledgment there was a tension she could neither shake nor fully understand. And in the quiet of the widow, drifting above the bustling hub, that subtle shift became another layer of the connection she shared with Arg, something unspoken, uncertain, yet undeniably present. Chapter 28. Hidden Weight. The morning in the hub began slowly, the corridors dim and humming with the low pulse of recycled air and distant machinery. The fires from the sabotage had been contained, but the smell of scorched metal and smoke still lingered faintly in the ventilation, giving the station a slightly acrid tang. Kara moved through the corridors, her boots echoing against the metal floor. Clipboard clutched tightly. The flutter in her stomach was back, subtle but insistent, leaving her with a quiet unease she couldn't shake. She paused at a junction near the north bay, pressing a hand tightly to her abdomen. A wave of nausea passed, mild but undeniable. She drew in a slow breath and told herself it was nothing more than just exhaustion, stress, the lingering tension from the fire and the long hours they'd been keeping. She straightened, brushing off the sensation and continuing her path toward the assembly area where Arg was already coordinating repairs and guild efforts. Arg's presence was grounding, as always. He moved with calm precision, issuing orders, adjusting schedules, checking logs. His eyes caught hers as she approached, and he gave a small nod. "Morning," he said, no hint of judgment, no probing questions. Kara appreciated it. She managed a quiet, strained smile in response. They spent the next hour walking the northern corridors, checking the repairs put in place after the sabotage. Kara's notes on the clipboard were meticulous, her handwriting tight and precise, but every few minutes the subtle nausea returned. Her hand drifted unconsciously to her midsection. She flexed her fingers, pressed them lightly against her side, shifted her stance, anything to quell the growing awareness that her body was signaling something she wasn't ready to name. Arg approached her, kneeling to inspect a support conduit that had been compromised during the minor fire. "This line is stable, but the fittings were warped. I reinforced them yesterday. It should hold until we get proper replacements," he said, voice low and steady. Kara's stomach fluttered again, and she had to press a hand against the clipboard to keep herself from swaying. She gave a small nod. "Looks solid," she said, her voice even. She didn't want to draw attention to the unease that had been creeping through her since yesterday. The thought that this might be something more serious never entered her mind. Not yet. She simply attributed it to the stress, the long shifts, the constant pressure of keeping the fledgling guild on track. Arg moved beside her, adjusting the conduit with practiced ease. His shoulder brushed hers briefly, and she caught a small spark of warmth and tension at the contact. She glanced quickly at him, but he was focused on the task, unaware of the subtle turmoil in her chest. She exhaled slowly, willing herself to concentrate. By midday, the station had returned to a semblance of normalcy. Miners moved through the corridors, some still whispering about the sabotage, some focused solely on their own work. Kara oversaw the redistribution of supplies, making sure that safety protocols were followed and that teams were reinforced where the fire had damaged support structures. Her notes grew more detailed, her instructions sharper, but the queasiness persisted, subtle and insistent, making her move with just a fraction more caution. Her steps measured, her hands lightly pressing against her abdomen every few minutes. Lunch came in a quiet wave. Kara sat in the common area, distant from most of the other guild members, legs tucked beneath her. She nibbled mechanically on a ration bar, the taste metallic, the texture dry. Each bite reminded her of the strange fluttering in her stomach. She shook her head, muttering under her breath, "Just tired, just stress." She didn't know why it wouldn't go away. Arg joined her, sitting across a small table with a careful awareness. He noticed the way her hand lingered over her midsection, but said nothing. His eyes were steady, patient. Kara appreciated the space, the quiet acknowledgement that he was there without probing for answers she wasn't ready to give. "You've been quiet all morning," he said, voice low. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," she said, forcing a small smile. "Just thinking." Another flutter in her stomach made her press a hand lightly over her side. "Nothing to worry about." Arg nodded once, his gaze steady but unreadable. He leaned back slightly, giving her room. Kara exhaled, relieved he didn't ask further. She wasn't ready to speak of it, not to him, not to anyone. The afternoon stretched on. Kara moved from one team to another, supervising repairs, checking logs, coordinating with engineers and miners. Each time she bent, each time she twisted to reach a panel or inspect a conduit, the subtle flutter in her stomach returned, persistent but still easy to dismiss as fatigue. She made mental notes to slow down, to take breaks, but the sense of responsibility overrode the discomfort. The guild depended on her attention, and she would not let herself falter. Arg moved silently at her side, issuing directions with a calm authority. Their steps fell into a rhythm, the quiet pulse of shared work grounding her. When their hands brushed during a minor adjustment, she felt the tension spike, her stomach fluttering again, and she had to bite her lip to keep from drawing attention to herself. Arg didn't notice. He was focused entirely on the work, his steady presence a shield she could lean against. By evening, Kara found a rare moment of stillness in the corner of the northern bay. She leaned against a support beam, clipboard resting on her knees, allowing herself a brief pause. The flutter in her stomach persisted, subtle but constant. She pressed a hand lightly against her abdomen, feeling the faint, inexplicable stirrings, and told herself once more it was fatigue, nothing more. She didn't know what else it could be, and she wasn't ready to consider any other possibilities. Arg appeared beside her, kneeling briefly to inspect a conduit, Everything okay here? He asked. Yeah, she replied quickly. She didn't look at him, didn't want him to notice the lingering tension in her stance. Just checking the reinforcements again. He nodded silently. His eyes flicked towards her, but he didn't push. Kara exhaled quietly, feeling a wave of relief at his patience. He trusted her to handle herself, and she allowed herself to rely on that trust, even as her own awareness of her body grew more persistent. Night settled across the hub. The activity slowed, the corridors dimmed, and the hum of machinery carried the station's heartbeat through the metal floors. Kara returned to the widow, moving quietly, her boots scuffing softly. The subtle nausea persisted, but she didn't give it a name. She only acknowledged it, letting the familiar vibration of the ship, the steady hum, and the faint warmth of the bulkheads calm her nerves. Inside the widow, she settled into the bunk, carefully adjusting her position for comfort. The fluttering in her stomach was still there, faint, insistent. She pressed a hand lightly over her abdomen, uncertain, unnerved by the persistent signal. She told herself again it was stress, fatigue, something minor. She did not yet consider the possibility that it could be something more profound. Arg remained in the cockpit, monitoring the ship's systems, quiet and attentive without intruding. Kara appreciated the unspoken understanding, the patience he offered without words. The shared silence allowed her to process her unease without the pressure of explanation. She rested for a while, letting the hum of the widow, the dim glow of the consoles, and the faint vibrations carry her toward a fragile sense of calm. The flutter persisted, a quiet, private signal that she didn't yet name. And in the quiet of the widow, drifting between the hub and the belt beyond, Kara whispered to herself, a soft breath in the dark. Not yet. The words were meant only for her, a quiet acknowledgement that whatever was beginning within her, whatever these subtle signs meant, it was not yet the time to face it, not yet the moment to reveal it. She closed her eyes, letting the steady rhythm of the widow, the quiet presence of Arg, and the unspoken trust between them carry her through the night. Chapter 29. The Miner's Stance. The station had settled into a rhythm again, though the aftershocks of the recent sabotage lingered in the edges of corridors, in the cautious movements of miners and guild members alike. Arg moved through the workshops and the supply bays with a deliberate pace, boots clanging softly on the metal flooring, eyes scanning every corner, every crate, every panel. He felt the weight of responsibility pressing on him, but not in the way a commander or a politician might. This was the tangible weight of keeping people alive, of ensuring that the guild, still fledgling, still fragile, held together under the pressure of the belt life. He paused near the main assembly deck, where a group of foremen had gathered to discuss leadership appointments. A formal offer would be drafted, one that would recognize him as the official head of the guild, with responsibilities extending beyond oversight of the miners' work into negotiation, administration, and diplomacy across the station. Arg's stomach tightened at the idea. Leadership had never been his goal. He had mined rocks and drifted in the belt for years, relied on solitude, and kept his focus on work that was measurable, tangible. Power and politics had always been in other people's games, and he had no desire to play. He stepped forward as the foreman looked up at him, papers in hand. Arg, one of them said, voice tight with respect and expectation. We've drafted this offer with the commander's blessing. The guild needs a leader. And everyone believes you're the one to take it on. Arg ran a hand through his hair, worn and streaked from hours of oversight, and shook his head. I'm a miner. I keep things moving. I make sure people don't get hurt. That's what I do. I'm not a leader in the way this paperwork describes. I don't want to be. A quiet ripple of murmurs passed through the assembly. Some eyes widened, others narrowed, measuring, judging. Arg didn't meet their gaze, only looked toward the floor as if he could somehow ground himself there. You have credibility, the foreman said insistently. Your knowledge, your experience. People listen to you. If not you, who? Someone else will try and fail. The guild needs direction, and you are it. Arg exhaled, slow and deliberate, then shook his head again. Direction is different from leadership. I can guide. I can instruct. I can fix problems. But I won't sit in a chair, sign documents, negotiate favors, or play politics. I'll always be a miner first. Always. A silence settled over the assembly deck, heavy and expectant. Arg felt it press against him, but he did not waver. He had learned long ago that certainty, even when uncomfortable, was a stronger foundation than compromise born of fear or expectation. Kara appeared by his side, quiet and steady. She had been overseeing the station's reinforcements and repairs since the fire, moving among the miners with an air of calm authority that seemed effortless. She looked at Arg, and in her eyes he saw a mixture of understanding and admiration, tinged with the secret awareness she had been carrying alone these past weeks. She didn't speak, only stood beside him, a quiet anchor. A foreman waited for his response, for any sign of hesitation. Arg straightened, shoulders squared, and spoke again, voice low but firm. I'll stay involved. I'll keep the guild on track, make sure the work gets done, and protect the miners. But I won't take a title. I won't sit in a chair signing papers or making deals I don't understand. That's not who I am. A few foremen shifted uneasily. Others exhaled quietly, processing the defiance and clarity of his stance. Kara's presence beside him offered subtle reassurance, though she remained silent, letting his words carry the weight they needed. You make an unusual choice, one foreman said finally. But perhaps that's exactly why people trust you. Arg glanced at Kara, who offered a small, approving nod. Her eyes caught his for a brief moment, and he allowed himself a fraction of a smile, fleeting but genuine. The unspoken bond between them had grown quietly over months of shared labor, long nights, and the small intimacies that came with living together on the Widow and coordinating the guild. It was subtle, fragile, yet undeniable. The foreman filed out slowly, some whispering about the implications of his decision, some admiring his refusal to choose titles or recognition. Arg watched them go, his mind returning to the practical matters, the schedules, the reinforcements, the repairs. Leadership in name was irrelevant. The real work, the tangible work, was what mattered. Kara finally spoke, voice soft but audible. And that's why they trust you, she said, a quiet smile on her lips. Arg allowed himself another glance at her, feeling the warmth of her presence settle around him like a protected layer. They moved together towards the northern bay, checking the remaining reinforcements and the temporary housing arrangements for guild members. Arg had already decided that, despite the station offering them the option of moving into semi-permanent quarters, he would remain aboard the Widow with Kara. It was not merely a preference. It was a recognition that solitude had lost its grip on him. Being on the ship with her, with someone that he trusted, he cared for, was far more valuable foundations than any station's quarters. Do you want to stay in the new housing, or? A junior foreman had asked earlier, presenting the offer politely. Arg had considered it briefly. The idea of walls that didn't creak, systems that hummed without reminders of every previous drift and repair. But Kara's quiet smile, her easy movements aboard the Widow, her presence in every shadowed corner of the ship's narrow corridors, drew him back to what mattered. We'll stay on the Widow, he had said decisively, so long as we get a semi-permanent berth here at the station. Nothing fancy. Just a place to offload supplies, get a rest, and keep the guild connected. Beyond that, we're fine on the ship. Kara had nodded, approving, her eyes reflecting quiet relief. She had grown accustomed to the Widow. its worn bulkheads and narrow corridors, the familiarity and privacy it offered, along with the companionship of Arg, made it more home than any station quarters could. As evening approached, the station lights dimmed to a softer glow. Arg and Kara sat in the cockpit of the Widow, the hum of systems providing a constant, grounding presence. The console lights cast faint reflections across their faces, highlighting the subtle exhaustion from the day's work. Kara's hand rested lightly on the edge of the console, brushing against Arg's without intent. The simple contact, so fleeting, sent a small pulse of warmth through him. He leaned back slightly in the pilot's chair, boots propped against the console, eye scanning the station through the viewport. The minor fires had been contained, the sabotage addressed, and the guild, though not yet fully established, had survived its first serious test. He allowed himself a deep breath, a rare moment of stillness in the constant motion of belt life. Kara mirrored his posture, leaning against the bulkhead, watching him more than the view outside. She had long since learned that moments like these, quiet and unspeaking, were as important as any discussion or plan. The subtle glance, the small touches, the shared silences, they were an unspoken bedrock of trust. "Feels better," Arg said finally, breaking the quiet. "Not just the guild, everything. Having this, having you, it's better than being alone." Kara's lips curved in a small private smile. She didn't respond verbally, only shifted slightly, allowing her presence to reinforce his words. He didn't need to say more. The understanding passed between them, silent but profound. Later, as the station lights dimmed further and most of the crews withdrew to their temporary berths or shifts aboard other vessels, Arg and Kara remained in the Widow. They organized supplies, checked the logs, and ensured that all guild operations were accounted for before settling in for the night. The faint flutter in Kara's stomach persisted. Subtle, persistent, but she said nothing. Arg's attention was on the systems, on the guild, on keeping everything steady, and that was enough. In the narrow corridor outside the cockpit, Kara whispered to herself, barely audible, "Not yet," a reminder to herself that some truths were hers to carry, for now, while the world and their lives continued around them. Arg, sitting in the chair, eyes half closed, felt the quiet weight of the day's work, the guild's fragile progress, and the presence of Kara beside him. He exhaled slowly, a rare, unburdened moment, thinking, "This is enough. For tonight. For now." The station hummed softly outside, a distant pulse of life and labor. The Widow held them, a small, steadfast anchor amid the chaos. And for Arg, for the first time in a long while, the idea of solitude felt incomplete. Being here, aboard the ship he'd always known as home, with her, was more than enough. And in that quiet understanding, a silent promise formed, unspoken but profound. Chapter 30. Silent Promise. Kara leaned against the bulkhead of the Widow, listening to the low hum of the station filtering through the open docking clamps. The docking arm was still fastened to the hull, metallic fingers gripping the hull plates, and a faint vibration ran through the deck as supply shuttles moved past the viewport. Everything was quieter than she had expected for a hub that ran day and night, a mechanical heartbeat in the dark. She could hear the distant whines of air recyclers and the occasional metallic clink as workers made their rounds outside the ship. From here, perched on the edge of her bunk, the station felt almost like a city from below the surface of water. Fuzzy outlines, murmurs of life, but no way to fully penetrate the depth of it. She exhaled slowly, letting her shoulders sag. The last week had been a strange balance between relief and tension. The guild had weathered the sabotage. Joran had been identified, reprimanded, and removed from his role. But the ripples of distrust lingered. She had walked the corridors of the hub, silently checking protocols, reassuring crews, and making notes on tweaks to prevent another incident. It was exhausting work, but not unwelcome. She felt useful in a way she hadn't before, and the subtle satisfaction of seeing miners and haulers trust the guild, even if just slightly, was a balm she hadn't realized she needed. Her hand brushed against her abdomen, almost absent-mindedly at first. It was a small, private acknowledgement, almost like an anchor in this whirlwind of the past days. She had convinced herself it was nothing at first, a faint fatigue, occasional nausea. But after the week of reflection, the quiet mornings, and the way her body reacted to even the simplest movements, she could no longer ignore it. She was carrying the future. She allowed herself a small smile, glancing toward Arg, who was across the ship at the console, fingers moving over worn keys as he updated station logs and double-checked hull sensors. His brow was furrowed, eyes narrowed in that familiar blend of concentration and quiet authority he carried so naturally. He didn't look at her, didn't know yet that she knew, and she wasn't ready to say anything aloud. Not yet. But the thought of him, of the quiet intimacy they shared, filled her chest with warmth she hadn't anticipated. "You've been staring for a while," he said without looking up, voice low, almost gruff. Kara blinked, coughed. "Just watching the docking crews, making sure no one trips over a line." She tried to sound casual, but a faint blush swept across her cheeks. "Uh-huh." He didn't elaborate, eyes back in the console. Kara knew better than to press. He had a way of shutting down conversation when focused. Instead, she let herself slink back into the bunk, hands folded loosely over her lap, feeling the ship creak softly beneath her weight. The Widow had become their home in the most literal sense. The crew quarters had been converted with their input, storage bins realigned, and a small workspace for Kara's calculations and logs established near the aft wall. The galley held 2 plates, 2 cups, and a small rack of utensils now. Even the sleeping pad had been rearranged so that they could both rest without feeling cramped, yet close enough that brushing against each other was unavoidable. The comfort was strange, but welcome, a reminder that even in a world of noise and danger, a simple stability could exist. Her gaze drifted to the viewport. Outside, the station's lighting cast sharp reflections against the Widow's hull. Miners moved along catwalks, trolleys clanging as cargo containers were shifted from shuttle to storage. She could see the faint haze of processed dust in the airlocks and smell the metallic tang even through the thick viewport glass. The belt was alive in a way the Dust Widow had never been when adrift, and she, strangely, felt anchored. "Commander Arlen stopped by while you were updating the logs," Arg said suddenly. Kara looked up, surprised he had been speaking. "He left a note for you, something about praising your organizational structure, and he asked if we wanted a more permanent berth at the station." Kara's hands tightened slightly around the thin blanket on the bunk. She had been thinking about this, about whether staying aboard the Widow made sense when the guild was expanding, when there was station resources to leverage. But the thought of leaving the Widow, leaving Arg in a space he had built and maintained, leaving her alongside him for any stretch of isolation, felt wrong. She shook her head subtly, but didn't speak. "I say we stay aboard," Arg continued, fingers still flying over the keys, "as long as we can maintain a semi-permanent berth." He seemed understanding, though I don't think he expected us to refuse the housing. "You mean you said that?" Kara murmured, a wry wit to her lips. He glanced up briefly, eyes soft. "We agreed together. Didn't want you thinking I'd do something without you." Kara's chest warmed at that. Together. That word had weight now. It implied a shared life aboard a ship built for solitude, a life she hadn't thought possible in months, maybe years. She pressed her palm to her abdomen again, letting herself imagine the months ahead. a life they could build together, even if no one else in the belt knew what was growing there. The guilt holding, she said quietly, shifting to sit cross-legged on the bunk. The sabotage, it rattled people, but I think we've proven we can respond. Protocols held, investigation closed. Joran handled. The miners are tentative, but hopeful. I've walked the decks, checked every docking clamp, every airlock seal. Nothing went wrong. Nothing went unnoticed. Arg leaned back from the console, rubbing at his eyes. I read your notes, detailed as ever. Every step covered, contingencies noted, redundancy verified. You've made sure they can't question the system again. I did what I had to, she said softly. But you? Her eyes met his. You held the line. You were the authority they listened to when I wasn't enough. She paused, the words faltering. I couldn't have done this without you. He exhaled, and for a long moment they just looked at each other. The faint hum of the station and the dust widow surrounding them, the hum of the markers, the subtle resonance left from their trials, thrummed faintly in the back of her skull, and she knew it was affecting them both, unspoken, unacknowledged, but undeniably present. Their connection felt deeper, tethered to something larger than either of them, and yet it was fragile, like glass pressing to a vibrating surface. Arg's voice broke the silence. Feels different now, less lonely. Even here, with all the noise and people, feels like I have a reason to not be alone. Kara nodded, unable to respond immediately. Her fingers drifted along the edge of the bunk, tracing the seam, thinking of what that meant. She didn't need to speak the truth of her secret yet, but it had weight, and she could feel it. And in that awareness, she realized that this life, this partnership, this future, was already taking shape. The afternoon passed into evening. They moved through their routines with quiet efficiency. Arg checked communication logs, verified shipments, monitored the guild's protocol updates, while Kara ran simulations and calculations on resource distribution and crew rotations. The station's lights dimmed outside as night fell in the belt, turning the viewport into a canvas of stars. They worked in near silence, occasionally exchanging glances, fingers brushing over shared data pads, subtle touches that spoke more than words could. At one point, Kara leaned over to point out a discrepancy in cargo logs. Her elbow nudged Arg's arm lightly. He froze for a heartbeat, then looked at her, eyebrows slightly raised before smirking faintly. Careful, he murmured. I don't want you toppling me over in my own berth. She laughed softly, the sound barely louder than the hum of the system. Not happening. You're far too solid. Solid. She repeated the word silently in her mind, thinking of the solidity of his presence, the steadiness of his hands, the calm authority he carried even when the station around them teetered. Solid. And now hers. She felt the weight of it in her chest, mingling with the secret she carried, and pressed her hand once more to her abdomen, heart thudding. Later, they shared a quiet meal, simple rations laid out on the small table. Conversation was light, teasing, but never straying far from the gravity of what had passed. Sabotage handled, protocol strengthened, guild stabilized. Arg's gaze occasionally flicked to her, observing, cautious, protective, unaware of the small life she was harboring. She let herself feel a quiet pride in their shared accomplishments, in the life that they were beginning to carve out in the belt together. As night deepened, the station lights dimmed further, and the hum of machinery became the dominant sound. Kara settled back on her bunk, watching Arg drift off at the console, eyelids heavy but unshakable, the markers humming faintly beneath the surface of their awareness. She reached out, hand brushed against his shoulder, then across to rest lightly over her abdomen. Soon, she whispered, not to him, but to herself. The word carried weight, a promise, a future. In the quiet of the Dust Widow, surrounded by the muted chaos of the hub, Kara felt the foundations of their world solidifying. The guild had survived its first true challenge. The belt was calmer for it. And in the small, intimate space of their shared ship, she knew something else had taken root. A bond, unspoken but unbreakable. And a secret she would carry alone for now. A tiny spark that was already beginning to shape the future. She closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the soft vibrations of the station, the creak of the docking clamps, the hum of the ship's systems. Arg's steady breathing filled the space beside her. The markers hummed faintly, a shared resonance between them, invisible but real. And in that quiet, Kara allowed herself the smallest of smiles. Soon, and with that promise, the night held them, still and calm, tethered together aboard the Dust Widow, their world set, their bond solid, and the future quietly stirring within her. Epilogue. Quiet foundations. The low hum of the belt's hub, distant machinery hummed through the thin walls of the Dust Widow's semi-permanent berth. Outside, the station's vast exterior lights glimmered across the void, reflecting off stray chunks of metal and the occasional drifting freighter. Docked among the angular lines of other ships, the Widow seemed ordinary at a glance, battered, utilitarian, and unremarkable. But inside, it carried the weight of months of survival, cooperation, and unspoken understanding. Arg sat in the cockpit, shoulders heavy, palms resting on knees, eyes tracing the slow rotation of the viewport's display. The console lights cast a soft, amber glow across his face, illuminating the fine lines that had deepened over months of long shifts and sleepless nights. He didn't move, didn't reach for the data log stacked neatly beside him, didn't check the station comms. Nothing urgent demanded it. The guild had functioned for weeks without incident. Miners followed the protocols Kara and he had hammered out. Accidents were rare, and disputes were quickly mediated. He could let himself breathe for the first time since the commander had suggested the guild. A soft creak echoed behind him as the airlock hatch opened. Kara stepped in, quiet but deliberate, hands brushing the metal edge for balance. Her hair fell loose, shadows dancing across her cheekbones from the overhead strip lights. She moved with her usual fluid certainty, but there was a hesitancy tonight, a slight tightness in her shoulders, the way she kept one hand tucked near her midsection. "You still awake?" she asked softly through the sound carried the weight of habit more than concern. "I've been sitting here for half an hour, watching empty corridors," Arg replied without turning, his voice low and rough. "Figured I'd keep an eye on nothing." She gave a small, ironic laugh, dropping into the folded pad next to the console. "Nothing feels empty anymore. Not since the guild's up and running. The station's quieter than I expected, though. Too quiet sometimes." Arg finally glanced at her, eyes narrowing slightly. "Quiet's good. Means nothing's on fire. Means the people are doing their jobs. And the protocols aren't failing. I like quiet." Kara tilted her head, catching the faintest shadow of a smirk. "I can't argue with that." Her gaze flicked downward to the space between them, then back to the viewport. Stars, distant and scattered, burned like frozen sparks in the black. "It feels like home, though, doesn't it?" He let the question hang, not because he didn't have an answer, but because answers have become complicated. The widow had never been home before. He had lived aboard her, yes. Years of solitary mining runs, years of walking to hums of systems and the rattle of bulkheads. But it had never felt like it had belonged to him in a way that mattered. Now, with her here, with Kara, it shifted. The air felt heavier with presence, warmer even than the station's recycled breath was still. Kara shifted, crossing her legs beneath her, and finally allowed her hand to rest lightly against her stomach. She didn't think of it as anything other than habit at first, brushing against herself, an unconscious tether to the life slowly unfolding. But the warmth it carried was undeniable, a subtle heat that pressed beneath her ribs. Arg noticed. He always noticed. But he didn't ask. He didn't speak. They had grown accustomed to the unspoken in each other's presence, the understanding that didn't need words. You didn't lead the guild, Kara said after a long pause, voice soft, almost teasing. You know they'd follow you if you tried. I'm a miner, he said, blunt, almost offensive. Not a leader. I fix things. I dig things up. I keep people from breaking bones. That's my role. And yet, she murmured, watching him, you built it anyway. He shrugged, looking back to the viewports, hand resting on his knees. I built it so that I could go home each night and not worry about what's burning or collapsing. I'm not doing it for anyone else. She let the statement linger in the air, because she understood. She had been forced to survive in chaos before, had learned to trust no one but herself, had seen what solitude did to a person's edges, and now, living in close quarters with him for months, sharing long shifts, small victories, near misses, she saw the truth. Arg's edges had softened for her presence, but the weight he carried never disappeared. It just shifted. Kara exhaled quietly and leaned back, letting her head rest against the bulkhead. The small pad creaked under her weight. Her eyes traced the console lights, the faint reflections of stars, and the contours of Arg's figure seated against the viewport. She let herself linger there, feeling the warmth of him in the confined space, feeling the pull that had grown over months of shared labor, shared silence, and subtle touches. Her hand brushed against her abdomen, this time cautiously, acknowledging what she had denied for days, weeks. She was pregnant. She had felt it for the first time in waves of fatigue, nausea, fleeting dizziness, but had argued with herself, rationalized, shifted blame. It wasn't until this past week that she had allowed herself to expect it. The faint heat beneath her palm, the pulse of life in her body, had confirmed it in a way that no thought or reasoning could deny. Arg didn't notice her change. Not yet. He had always been slow to notice subtleties, but she didn't mind. Not now. It was hers alone to carry in this moment, a secret promise she would hold until the time was right. You've been quiet, he said finally, eyes flickering to her, observing, not praying. All week. You're thinking. She shrugged, letting the hand on her stomach stay there. Just tired, she said lightly, but it was half truth. He studied her, chest tight with unspoken words. He wanted to ask, to probe, to see what weighed on her mind, but he didn't. She had earned her space, as he had earned his own over the years. Some things, he knew, revealed themselves in time. Minutes stretched. The low hum of life support filled the gaps. Lights from the station outside flickered faintly, casting angular shadows across the narrow cabin. The widow smelled faintly of oil, recycled air, and the lingering tang of metal, comforting in its familiarity, grounding in its consistency. I like this, he said after a while. Being here, docked, not worrying about collapse or explosion, just being. She nodded, not lifting her gaze. It's good. We've earned it. All of it. He tilted his head. We did. Together. The statement lingered, heavy with implication. Together. Not alone. Not just cohabitating. Present. Consistent. Unspoken, but undeniable. She let her hand linger on her abdomen, tracing the faint curve. Soon, she thought. Soon he would know. And soon they would have a new weight to carry together. But for now, She watched him, memorized the set of his shoulders, the way his jaw tensed as he exhaled, the faint flicker of stubble across his face. She memorized the quiet of him, the solidity, the grounding presence that had become her constant. The air in the cockpit shifted slightly as he moved, standing, stretching, shoulders that carried more than anyone would ever know. He walked past her, careful not to disturb her pad, careful not to disturb the fragile balance of presence and space. She watched the subtle brush of his sleeve across the bulkhead, felt the ghost of proximity, and a warmth pooled in her chest that had nothing to do with the temperature of the station or the recycled air. "You know," he said finally, voice low, casual, almost indifferent, "I'd rather be here, with you, in this cramped, leaky metal box that smells like old fuel and leftover lunch. I'd rather be here than anywhere else in the belt." She didn't respond immediately, allowing the weight of the words to settle. She could feel the pulse of life beneath her palm, the quiet promise of continuity and change. She pressed her hand lightly against him, almost without thinking, just enough for the warmth to transmit, just enough for him to notice. He stopped mid-step, shoulders stiffening. He glanced down at her hand, then back to the console lights. "Feels less lonely," he said quietly, "with you here." She smiled softly, letting herself lean back into the pad, letting the edges of worry and fear dissolve, if only a little. "Good," she whispered, "because I'm not going anywhere." The station beyond the viewport hummed with distant life, freighters gliding past, automated cranes shifting cargo, lights flickering across steel skeletons of habitation modules. Yet inside the Widow, the world was compressed to the space between them. The faint thrum of the hull, the low buzz of lights, the warmth of shared breath, and the unspoken promise of a future she now carried. Minutes passed, hours blurred. They spoke intermittently, about supplies, about minor adjustments to guild logistics, about the occasional miner who needed mediation, but mostly they sat together, close but not touching, presence folding into presence. Every glance, every accidental brush of the hand or shoulder carried weight, carried meaning, carried history. Kara closed her eyes for a moment, resting her head back. The glow from her palm on her stomach pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat of its own. Soon, she thought, soon the balance of their lives would shift again, irrevocably, with the weight of what she carried. And yet, she could allow herself this calm, this quiet, this fleeting sense of belonging. Arg exhaled, leaning back against the cockpit frame, boots resting lightly on the console edge. His eyes traced the stars, distant, cold, indifferent, and yet somehow grounding. He didn't speak of the trials, didn't speak of the markers, didn't speak of the pressures of the belt. Not tonight. Tonight the world was small, contained, known. Kara's hands lingered on her abdomen. She traced a line, a gentle curve, as if drawing the future into the present. "Soon," she whispered, and the word hung in the air, unclaimed, unchallenged, but certain. Arg shifted, catching the whisper, but he didn't ask. Some things were better left to time, to revelation, to quiet acknowledgement. He simply watched the stars, felt the weight of presence beside him, and allowed himself, for the first time in years, to feel settled, to feel tethered, to feel less alone. Outside, the station's lights flickered, freighters drifted, and the belt spun in on its indifferent rotation. Inside, the Widow carried two souls who had survived, who had endured, who had built a life in the edge between danger and routine, and one small secret pulse of life, a future as yet unspoken, waiting to be born. They did not speak of love, not aloud, not tonight, but in every glance, every touch, Every shared breath, it was there. The Dust Widow docked quietly, hummed low and steady, a fragile sanctuary in the vast, indifferent void. And for the first time in years, Arg did not feel alone. Kara's palms rested lightly against the future she carried, and she allowed herself a rare, quiet smile. Soon, she whispered again, this time for herself, and let the silence answer. The end of Part 6 of Void Miner, Guild of Stone.